I'm going to say something that will sound uncomfortable, but it's precise. Trying harder will not make an unhappy woman happy. In fact, the more you try, the worse it gets. Flowers don't fix it. Apologies don't fix it. Sacrifice doesn't fix it. There is a reason so many men reach the same quiet conclusion in different homes, different marriages, different cities across America. Nothing is ever enough. This isn't about effort. It's not about love. It's not even about compatibility. It's about a psychological mechanism that runs long before you enter the picture. A mechanism that turns improvement into expectation care, into obligation and stability, into boredom. If you don't understand it, you will spend years negotiating with a problem that was never yours to solve. What I'm about to share isn't rage or blame. It's observation, repeated, verified, painfully learned. Before we begin, tell me where you're listening from and what time it is there right now. And if this kind of honest, grounded conversation matters to you, consider subscribing. Calmly, no pressure. I didn't arrive at this understanding through theory. I arrived through repetition, painful, methodical repetition. Over several years, I dated women who had nothing in common on the surface. Different ages, different careers, different personalities, different backgrounds. If you line them up, you would never think the outcomes would be the same. But they were. Each relationship followed the same arc. In the beginning, there was ease, lightness, affection, that early sense of relief where everything feels aligned. The honeymoon phase didn't feel fake. It felt real. That's important, because this isn't about deception at the start. It's about what emerges later. Slowly, something shifted, not all at once. Quietly, almost politely at first. A comment here, a sigh there, a look that lingered half a second too long. Then patterns formed. Dissatisfaction became more frequent, more global, less specific. With the first woman, the complaint was romance. I wasn't expressive enough, not spontaneous enough, not emotionally demonstrative in the way she wanted. So I took that lesson seriously. I internalized it as a flaw. In the next relationship, I corrected for it. I became deliberate, planned dates, surprise trips, wrote things down, paid attention to details. I leaned into softness. The result wasn't gratitude, it was a new criticism. I was too accommodating, too gentle. Not masculine enough, not decisive. So I adjusted again. With the third woman, I took charge, made decisions, set direction, led. I was calm and firm. That created a different problem. Now I didn't consider her feelings enough. I didn't ask for her input often enough. I was controlling, dismissive. At some point, the pattern became impossible to ignore. The behavior changed. The outcome didn't. Every adjustment fixed one complaint and immediately created another. The target moved the moment I reached it. And that's when something important clicked. This wasn't feedback. It was expression. The dissatisfaction existed before it attached itself to me. I began to notice something else. These women weren't unhappy only with me. They were unhappy with their jobs, with their families, with their bodies, with their pasts, with their futures, with life in general. The relationship just became the closest, safest place to aim it. That distinction matters, because when a problem is about you, it's specific, it's consistent, it improves when you address it. This didn't. This expanded. It adapted. It survived every correction. I remember sitting across from one of them during what should have been a normal conversation. Nothing dramatic had happened. No conflict, no fight. And yet there was tension, a heaviness in the room. I asked what was wrong. She paused, searched, then landed on something minor. Something inconsequential. But the emotional weight behind it was far larger than the issue itself. That's when I understood. The issue was just a container. The feeling came first. Men are trained to believe that effort creates results, that logic works in most areas of life. Work harder, improve your skill, refine your approach. Relationships are often framed the same way. If something is wrong, you fix it. If someone is unhappy, you adjust. But that model breaks when unhappiness isn't a response. It's a baseline. Once I saw that, I started looking backward, not just at my relationships, but at the men around me. Friends, colleagues, married men I respected, different lives. Same sentence, spoken quietly, usually after a drink. Nothing I do is ever enough. They weren't lazy men. They weren't cruel. They weren't disengaged. Most of them were exhausted. They had tried everything they knew how to try. And the more they tried, the smaller they became. They apologized for things they didn't do, took responsibility for moods they didn't cause, walked on invisible lines that kept shifting. Over time, something happened to them. Their posture changed. Their tone softened. Their certainty eroded. They weren't becoming better partners. They were becoming more careful men. That's the cost of misidentifying the problem. I also noticed something else that's uncomfortable to admit. The dissatisfaction didn't spike during hardship. It spiked during stability. When things were calm, predictable, safe. That's when the criticism intensified, as if peace itself was suspicious. That observation shattered another assumption. I had believed unhappiness came from stress, pressure, or lack. But here it was emerging in abundance, in comfort, in security. Which forced a harder conclusion. If unhappiness grows when conditions improve, then conditions aren't the cause. This wasn't about my inadequacy. It wasn't about incompatibility. It wasn't even about the women being malicious or manipulative. Most of them weren't. They were sincere in their frustration. They genuinely felt dissatisfied. The problem was where that dissatisfaction originated. Once I stopped taking it personally, the pattern became clearer. Each relationship wasn't a unique failure. It was the same mechanism playing out with different faces, different words, different justifications. And that realization did something critical. It removed urgency. When you believe you're the problem, you rush, you scramble, you overcorrect. When you see the pattern, you slow down, you observe. I stopped asking, what am I doing wrong, and started asking what existed before I arrived. The answer was always the same. They were unhappy before me. They were unhappy with me. And based on what I later saw, they were unhappy after me. The relationship wasn't the source. It was the stage. That's not an accusation. It's a diagnosis. And diagnoses matter because they determine treatment. You don't perform surgery on a symptom. You don't negotiate with a condition that isn't relational. This was the first real layer of the truth. The personal proof. Before theories, before explanations, before frameworks. Just repetition. Clean, unforgiving repetition. Once you see it, you can't unsee it. Once that realization settled in, I began paying attention to the language of dissatisfaction, not the words themselves, but their structure. Because what stood out wasn't intensity, it was totality. The complaints were never isolated. They spread. It wasn't, I don't like this one thing. It was everything feels wrong. If I brought flowers, they were the wrong kind. If I didn't, I wasn't thoughtful. If I planned a night out, it wasn't the right place. If I stayed in, I wasn't making an effort. If I worked long hours, I was absent. If I came home early, I lacked ambition. If I helped around the house, I did it wrong. If I didn't, I was selfish. Each behavior contained its own built-in failure. At first, I treated these as solvable contradictions. I thought balance was the answer, that if I could just calibrate correctly, the tension would ease. But balance didn't exist in this system. Every solution produced a new dissatisfaction, equal in size, but different in shape. That's when I noticed something subtle. The dissatisfaction wasn't responding to reality. It was responding to proximity. The closer I was, the more responsibility I carried for her internal state. This is where many men get trapped. When a woman you care about is unhappy, you instinctively assume cause. You search for the mistake, the oversight, the tone, the timing. You believe there must be a correct combination of actions that leads to peace. And because you're invested, you keep trying. But here's the detail no one explains. When dissatisfaction is global, it's not feedback, it's displacement. Global dissatisfaction doesn't mean you're failing at everything. It means everything has become a target. I remember one argument that made this unmistakable. It started over something trivial. I don't even remember what it was. What I remember is how quickly it escalated. Within minutes, it wasn't about the issue anymore. It was about my character, my habits, my past decisions, my future potential, my tone, my values, even my silence. Nothing was off limits. That's when it became clear. This wasn't conflict resolution. This was emotional offloading. In healthy disagreement, the scope narrows. In chronic dissatisfaction, the scope expands. It pulls everything into itself until the relationship becomes a courtroom and you're always on trial. And no matter how carefully you defend yourself, the verdict is already decided. What made this especially disorienting was the inconsistency. Some days the same behavior was praised. Other days it was criticized. There was no stable standard, no fixed rulebook, which meant there was no way to win, only ways to delay the next wave. Over time, I watched myself change in ways I didn't recognize at first. I became hyper-aware, monitored my words, anticipated reactions, adjusted tone before speaking, not out of manipulation, but out of self-preservation. That's the hidden cost. You don't become more loving. You become more cautious. Men rarely talk about this, but they feel it. The constant low-level anxiety, the sense that peace is temporary and conditional, that any calm moment might just be the quiet before the next dissatisfaction finds a reason. And here's the most damaging part. The man internalizes it. He starts believing the story, that he's inadequate, that he's emotionally deficient, that he lacks something fundamental. Not because of evidence, but because repetition creates conviction. When you're told in 100 different ways that you're not enough, eventually you stop asking whether the statement is true and start asking how to compensate for it. This is where men begin shrinking themselves. They sacrifice preferences, stop expressing disagreement, abandon boundaries. They believe harmony requires self-erasure, but harmony never arrives. Instead, the dissatisfaction intensifies, because now there's less resistance, less structure, less polarity. And ironically, that makes the woman even more dissatisfied. Not because she wants conflict, but because the dynamic itself has lost shape. I saw this clearly in marriages around me. Men who once had presence now moved cautiously in their own homes. Men who once spoke decisively now asked permission for things that didn't require it. Not because their wives demanded it directly, but because the cost of displeasure had trained them. They weren't weak men. They were conditioned men, And the most tragic part was that many of them believed this was love, that enduring dissatisfaction was proof of commitment, that sacrifice was synonymous with care. It isn't. Care involves responsiveness. It doesn't involve absorbing someone else's unresolved internal state and calling it responsibility. Another pattern became obvious once I stepped back. The dissatisfaction didn't lessen when problems were solved. It relocated. If finances improved, it moved to emotional availability. If emotional availability improved, it moved to ambition. If ambition improved, it moved to lifestyle. The object changed. The feeling didn't. That tells you something critical. The dissatisfaction is not object-dependent. This is why logic fails here. Men approach this as a series of fixable issues. But what they're dealing with is a system that requires dissatisfaction to function. Without it, there's no narrative, no identity, no emotional momentum. That's why calm can feel threatening. Calm removes the familiar friction. And when someone is organized around friction, peace feels empty. I want to be precise here. This isn't about women being malicious or consciously unfair. Most aren't. They genuinely experience the dissatisfaction. It feels real to them. But feelings can be real without being accurate. Understanding that difference is what separates men who lose themselves from men who don't. Once I accepted that the dissatisfaction wasn't actually about me, something shifted internally. I stopped defending every point, stopped rushing to fix, stopped absorbing blame reflexively, not out of indifference, out of clarity. And with that clarity came a sobering realization. If the dissatisfaction wasn't created by me, it couldn't be resolved by me. Which meant the effort I was pouring into it wasn't noble. It was misdirected. This wasn't a relationship problem. It was a pattern problem. And patterns don't respond to appeasement. They respond to awareness. That awareness didn't end the dissatisfaction, but it did end my confusion. And that matters more than people think. Once the emotional fog cleared, I started looking for something more fundamental than behavior. Because if dissatisfaction wasn't caused by circumstances, effort, or compatibility, then it had to be rooted deeper. That search led me to a layer most people avoid because it feels impersonal and uncomfortable. Biology. There is a difference between temporary unhappiness and a dispositional orientation toward dissatisfaction. Some people return to contentment after problems pass. Others don't. They default to dissatisfaction regardless of conditions. And research has been clear on this for decades. Roughly half of personality traits, including baseline optimism versus pessimism, are influenced by genetics. That means some people are born with nervous systems that scan for what's wrong. Their attention naturally gravitates toward absence, flaw, or threat. This isn't a moral failure. It's a predisposition, like height, like metabolism, like temperament. When I began viewing certain women through this lens, patterns sharpened. Their dissatisfaction wasn't episodic, it was constant. It didn't spike only during stress, it existed during calm. It wasn't situational, it was atmospheric. No matter how favorable the environment, the internal narrative remained unchanged. Something was missing, something was wrong, something needed to be corrected. I saw this play out not just in relationships, but in families. Grandmothers who were perpetually unhappy, mothers who carried the same tone, daughters who inherited both the language and the posture of dissatisfaction before they were old enough to understand it. 3 generations, same emotional climate. The details changed, the complaints updated with the times, but the core orientation remained, a reflexive focus on what isn't right. I watched women who could improve their lives dramatically and feel no relief. New house, new relationship, new career. The relief lasted briefly, if at all. Then the dissatisfaction reasserted itself as if the system were correcting back to baseline. That's the key concept, baseline. For some people, contentment is the baseline. Stress pulls them away from it. For others, dissatisfaction is the baseline. Improvement pulls them away from it temporarily, but the system always drifts back. This explains something that confuses many men. Why things feel worse after progress. Why effort doesn't accumulate. Why every solved problem reveals another. You're not building toward peace. You're temporarily interrupting a pattern that will reassert itself. It's important to say this clearly. Genetic predisposition does not mean inevitability, but it does mean resistance. Changing baseline orientation requires sustained conscious effort, self-awareness, regulation, accountability. Most people never do that work. They live inside their defaults and call them truth. When a woman with a predisposition toward dissatisfaction enters a relationship, she doesn't suddenly become different. She brings her baseline with her. At first, novelty masks it. Attraction overrides it. But novelty fades. Attraction stabilizes. And the baseline returns. This is why the honeymoon phase is misleading. Men think they've found the exception. They think they've done something right. But what they're experiencing isn't a new baseline. It's a temporary suspension of an old one. Once that suspension lifts, the man assumes he caused the change. He didn't. He just witnessed the return. Understanding this reframes everything. It explains why logic doesn't help, why reassurance doesn't land, why progress doesn't stick. You're not addressing a problem. You're working against an orientation, and orientations don't respond to external correction. I want to be careful here. This isn't about labeling women as broken. It's about recognizing variance. Just as some people are naturally calm and others naturally anxious, some are naturally content and others naturally dissatisfied. Problems arise when this variance is denied, when dissatisfaction is moralized as insight, when chronic unhappiness is reframed as depth intelligence or sensitivity. I've heard it said many times, she's just perceptive. She has high standards. She knows what she wants. Those phrases often mask something simpler. She is oriented toward what's missing. That orientation doesn't disappear because someone loves her well. It doesn't recalibrate because someone sacrifices more. If anything, sacrifice reinforces it. Because now dissatisfaction has proof of power. Another thing became clear once I accepted this layer. Men who stay in these dynamics often share one trait. They believe love means adaptation. They believe their role is to neutralize her discomfort. But you can't neutralize a baseline. You can only accommodate it. And accommodation slowly becomes self-erasure. I saw men age faster in these relationships. Not physically, but internally. Their nervous systems were always alert, always monitoring, always compensating. That level of vigilance is exhausting. Meanwhile, the woman remains dissatisfied, not because the man failed, but because the system demands it. This is why attempts to be better often backfire. When you improve, you raise expectations. When you meet expectations, new ones appear. When you remove friction, dissatisfaction finds a new object. It's not conscious, but it's consistent. The hardest part of accepting this truth is emotional, not intellectual. It means letting go of the belief that you can earn peace. That if you just figure it out, love will stabilize the system. For men who define themselves through responsibility, That's brutal. It feels like failure to accept limits. It feels like giving up, but it isn't. It's accuracy. Once I understood the genetic layer, I stopped personalizing what wasn't personal. I stopped interpreting dissatisfaction as information about my worth. I stopped believing I could calibrate myself into being enough. That didn't make relationships easier, but it made reality clearer. And clarity, while uncomfortable, is far less destructive than confusion. Genetics may set the foundation, but childhood is where the structure is built. This is where predisposition turns into pattern. When I looked closely at the women who lived in chronic dissatisfaction, almost every one of them shared one of two formative histories, often both. The first was a fractured relationship with their father. The details varied, but the imprint was the same. Sometimes he was physically absent, sometimes emotionally unavailable, sometimes present, but unpredictable, critical, or harsh. In some cases, he wasn't abusive in obvious ways. He was simply distant, preoccupied, unreliable. To a child, especially a daughter, that absence doesn't register as circumstance. It registers as meaning. She internalizes a quiet conclusion about men: that they don't show up, that they disappoint, that their attention must be earned or chased, that love from the masculine is conditional. Those beliefs don't stay conscious. They become assumptions, expectations, filters through which every adult relationship is interpreted. So when she enters a relationship as an adult, she's not just relating to the man in front of her. She's relating to a memory, to an unresolved template. And that template is primed for disappointment. Even when she chooses a decent man, she unconsciously recreates the emotional dynamic she knows. She tests, she doubts, she criticizes, she pushes. And when he eventually fails to meet the impossible standard, the old belief is confirmed. Men disappoint. What she doesn't see is her role in manufacturing that outcome. The second pattern was just as powerful. Growing up with a chronically dissatisfied mother, a woman who complained constantly about her husband, her life, her sacrifices, her circumstances, the child absorbs this not as information, but as identity. This is how women are. This is what marriage feels like. This is what adulthood looks like. Children don't analyze their parents. They normalize them. So the daughter grows up believing dissatisfaction is maturity, that criticism is intelligence, that being unhappy means you're paying attention. She learns that love is expressed through complaint, not appreciation. By the time she's an adult, the programming is invisible to her. It doesn't feel learned. It feels true. I've watched women swear they would never become their mothers, then slowly repeat their exact words. Same tone, same size, same criticisms, same emotional climate. Not because they wanted to, but because familiarity has gravity. Humans choose what feels familiar over what feels peaceful unless they are deeply conscious. This explains why some women feel uncomfortable in healthy relationships. Stability feels wrong. Calm feels suspicious. The absence of tension feels like something is missing. So they create it, not maliciously, automatically. Another thing became clear when I traced these childhood patterns. Many women enter adulthood believing relationships are supposed to complete them, that love should heal their wounds, that a partner should fill the emptiness left by childhood absence. That belief is devastating, because no partner can do that. And when the inevitable failure occurs, she experiences it as betrayal rather than impossibility. She believes he failed her, that he wasn't enough, that if he loved her properly, she wouldn't feel this way. So she escalates demands, raises expectations, applies pressure. The man feels the weight but doesn't understand the origin. He thinks he's dealing with present needs. He's actually dealing with past wounds. This is where resentment begins on both sides. She resents him for not fixing what he didn't break. He resents her for holding him responsible for something he can't access. Neither names it. Both suffer. What makes this especially destructive is that childhood programming resists contradiction. When something feels normal, alternatives feel wrong, even if they're healthier. A woman raised in dissatisfaction will distrust contentment. It doesn't match her internal map. I've seen women sabotage relationships that were objectively good because they didn't feel intense enough. The man was consistent, reliable, kind. But the relationship lacked the emotional volatility she grew up with. And without that volatility, it felt flat, empty, wrong. So she stirred conflict, picked fights, created tests. Not because she wanted pain, but because she wanted familiarity. This is where many men get confused. They believe providing safety should create peace. But for someone whose nervous system associates love with tension, safety feels like neglect. No amount of reassurance changes that without conscious work. And most people don't even realize they're operating on old software. Another layer of childhood programming shows up in expectations. Women who watch their mothers sacrifice endlessly often carry a sense of quiet entitlement. Not in a cruel way, but in a wounded one. I've suffered so life owes me. I watched her suffer so I deserve more. That belief creates an impossible standard. No real man can repay a symbolic debt. And when reality doesn't deliver compensation for past pain, dissatisfaction fills the gap. What's dangerous is how invisible this is to the person living it. She doesn't wake up thinking I'm recreating my childhood. She wakes up thinking I'm unhappy and something must be wrong. The nearest object becomes the explanation. This is why arguing facts never works. This isn't about logic. It's about pattern reinforcement. When I saw this clearly, I stopped interpreting dissatisfaction as information about the present. I started seeing it as echo. Old emotion looking for a new cause. That shift didn't make the relationships easier, but it made them intelligible. And once something becomes intelligible, you stop blaming yourself for not solving it. After genetics and childhood, the next layer was expectation. This one is quieter, but just as corrosive. It doesn't come from trauma or temperament. It comes from stories, from images, from promises made indirectly over years without ever being questioned. Modern women are raised inside a fantasy about relationships. It's not one source, it's cumulative. Movies, television, romantic narratives, social media. Every one of them feeds the same idea. Love should be transformative. A relationship should feel like a rival. Marriage should complete something. So when a woman enters a relationship, she doesn't just bring herself. She brings an expectation that this connection will fix what still hurts. That intimacy will erase emptiness. That being chosen will finally quiet the internal doubt. When it doesn't happen, when the internal landscape remains unchanged, confusion sets in. Because the promise was never framed as conditional. It was framed as inevitable. I remember a woman I knew, I'll call her Anna. Smart, attractive, successful by most measures. She married a man who adored her. He was stable, present, kind. There was no obvious dysfunction. 6 months after the wedding, she was miserable. Not dramatic misery. A dull, constant dissatisfaction. She couldn't name a clear cause. So she searched. And eventually she found one. He wasn't romantic enough. He wasn't ambitious enough. He wasn't attentive enough. None of these were new traits. They were simply newly blamed. What Anna expected, though she couldn't articulate it, was that marriage would heal her, that it would fill the unresolved gaps from her past. When it didn't, the disappointment had to go somewhere. And it went to the closest target. This is projection in its purest form. Internal emptiness attributed to external conditions. Men experience this pattern constantly. If only we made more money. So they do. Still unhappy. If only we had a bigger place. They get it. Still unhappy. If only you listened more. They listen. Now they're suffocating. The dissatisfaction doesn't resolve because the source hasn't changed. Only the object has. Another factor magnifies this expectation gap. Social media. It has distorted perception beyond recognition. Women are no longer comparing their lives to neighbors or friends. They are comparing them to curated performances of thousands of strangers. Every scroll delivers evidence that someone else is happier, more loved, more celebrated, more fulfilled. And because these images aren't framed as fiction, they register as standards. She doesn't consciously think this is fake. She feels this is what I'm missing. I've watched marriages unravel because of this. Men working 60 hours a week to provide a comfortable life, only to be told it isn't enough. Not because it isn't objectively sufficient, but because it doesn't match a fantasy fed by images of vacations, luxury, and constant excitement. The comparison isn't fair, but it feels real. What's rarely acknowledged is how unrealistic these expectations are statistically. The lifestyle being normalized online belongs to a tiny fraction of people. But when it's constantly visible, it feels attainable, deserved, expected. So when reality doesn't match the fantasy, dissatisfaction becomes moral. Life feels unjust, and someone must be responsible. That someone is usually the partner. Another pattern sits beneath this. The belief that desire should be constant, that attraction should never wane, that excitement should be permanent. When routine sets in, it's interpreted as failure rather than inevitability. No one teaches that depth replaces novelty, that stability is quieter than passion, that long-term connection trades intensity for meaning. So when intensity fades, she believes something is wrong, that she settled, that she chose incorrectly, that someone else would keep the feeling alive. That belief fuels what I came to think of as the moving horizon. The goal is always just out of reach. When one desire is met, another appears. Not because the first wasn't fulfilled, but because fulfillment itself wasn't the point. Expectation becomes an appetite, not a destination. This explains why some women feel most dissatisfied when they have everything. Because having everything reveals that the promise was false. That external accumulation doesn't resolve internal unrest. That realization is painful. So it's avoided. And the blame is reassigned. The man becomes the symbol of the gap between expectation and reality. Not because he created it, but because he's present. What makes this especially damaging is that expectations are rarely communicated clearly. They are assumed. When unmet, they are experienced as neglect or betrayal, even though they were never realistic to begin with. Men are then punished for failing invisible standards. I saw this repeatedly. Women upset about things their partners never agreed to provide. Emotional states, life outcomes, personal fulfillment. The man becomes responsible not just for the relationship, but for her internal satisfaction with life. That's an impossible role. And the more a man tries to inhabit it, the more distorted the dynamic becomes. He stops being a partner and becomes a regulator of mood, an emotional service provider. No one thrives in that role. Understanding this layer changed how I interpreted dissatisfaction. It wasn't disappointment with me. It was disappointment with reality itself. Once I saw that I stopped trying to compete with fantasy. You can't win against an illusion. You can only exhaust yourself trying. Expectation without self-awareness is a trap. And when it's reinforced culturally, it becomes invisible. That invisibility is what makes it so powerful. By the time I reached this layer, the pattern was no longer subtle. Comparison had become the fuel. And unlike earlier generations, this one never shuts off. There is no silence from it, no neutral space. The mind is constantly fed images of other lives, other relationships, other versions of happiness. Comparison used to be local. Now it's infinite. Every woman carries a window in her pocket showing her what everyone else appears to have. Anniversaries, engagements, renovations, vacations, bodies, babies, promotions, transformations. Each image is framed as evidence. Evidence that life could be better, that her choices were flawed, that she settled. What makes this especially destructive is that comparison rarely includes context. She sees the trip to Paris, not the infidelity. She sees the husband helping with the kids, not the unemployment. She sees the highlight, not the cost. But the emotional impact is real. I've watched women build entire narratives of dissatisfaction from these fragments. One post becomes a judgment. Another becomes confirmation. Soon the story is complete. Everyone else is doing better, and someone must be responsible for that gap. Again, the closest target is the partner. This comparison pressure amplifies something else I noticed: the devaluation mechanism. The moment something becomes hers, it loses its shine. Not because it changed, but because ownership alters perception. When she was single, she wanted a relationship. When she got one, she wanted marriage. When she married, she wanted a different kind of man. The wanting never stopped, only the object changed. This pattern isn't limited to relationships. It appears everywhere. She wants a certain body, achieves it, fixates on another flaw, wants a career, gets it, wants to stay home, stays home, wants the career back. Each achievement briefly interrupts dissatisfaction, then becomes the new baseline. The partner is no exception. The man she couldn't live without becomes the man she can barely tolerate. His jokes shift from charming to irritating. His stability shifts from reassuring to boring. His attention shifts from loving to suffocating. Nothing about him changed. Her perception did. But perception feels like truth. So she concludes he misrepresented himself, that he changed, that he isn't who she thought he was. The idea that her valuation system is unstable never crosses her mind. This is how resentment builds on false premises. I've seen men twist themselves trying to recover a version of themselves that only existed under novelty. They become performers. They chase an earlier dynamic that cannot be recreated. Not because they failed, but because the system moved on. Comparison intensifies this process. Because now there's always another man on the screen, another lifestyle, another option. Even if she would never choose it in reality, its mere visibility creates dissatisfaction. This is what grass is greener looks like when magnified by technology. It's not just imagining alternatives, it's being fed them daily. What many men don't realize is that this erodes gratitude. When attention is always outward, appreciation has no space to form. Everything becomes temporary, replaceable, conditional, and relationships cannot survive in a constant audition. Another layer of comparison comes from time. The biological clock. Women are acutely aware of it, whether they admit it or not. It creates a background anxiety that colors everything. Either she's rushing toward milestones, resentful of the pressure, or she's reached them and resentful they didn't deliver what was promised, or she's missed them and resentful of what can't be reclaimed. There is no stable position inside that frame. I remember a conversation with a woman in her late 30s. On paper, her life was solid. Career, apartment, relationship. She wasn't struggling materially, but she was deeply unhappy. She said something I've never forgotten. I did everything right according to the plan I made at 20. But the plan was wrong, and now it's too late to change it. That sentence carried more dissatisfaction than any argument. It wasn't about her partner. It was about time, about comparison with imagined futures that never happened. Her partner became the symbol of a life that didn't unfold as expected. Comparison with the past is just as corrosive as comparison with others. When dissatisfaction is fed from every direction, it becomes constant. And when it's constant, it becomes identity. I noticed how often women bonded through complaint, how dissatisfaction became social glue. Shared grievances, shared resentment, shared narratives of being shortchanged by life. Happiness in that environment feels isolating. If one woman becomes content, she risks being excluded. Complaint maintains belonging. This reinforces the pattern. Dissatisfaction is rewarded with attention, with validation, with solidarity. Men don't see this because they aren't inside those conversations. They only see the outcome. What looks like personal criticism is often cultural reinforcement, and the devaluation continues. The more a man tries to prove his worth, the more replaceable he becomes in the imagination. Because the standard is no longer him. It's the idea of something better. Once I understood this, I stopped trying to compete with other men who didn't exist, with lives curated for effect, with illusions optimized for envy. You can't anchor a relationship in comparison. It guarantees drift. This layer doesn't create dissatisfaction alone, but it feeds it relentlessly. It ensures there's always another reason, another standard, another disappointment waiting. And no amount of effort can outrun an endless feed. As the layers stacked, another pattern became impossible to ignore: insincerity. Not in the sense of malice, but in the sense of performance. Many women are taught from a young age that being chosen requires presentation, that love is conditional on fitting a role. So they learn to wear masks. They present themselves as easygoing when they're high maintenance, as agreeable when they're controlling, as domestic when they resent routine, as sexual when they're disconnected from their own desire. Not because they want to deceive, but because they believe their authentic self wouldn't be selected. This creates a quiet split. The woman being chosen isn't the woman being lived, and that split is exhausting. At first, the performance works, the relationship forms, the man commits, the mask stays on as long as necessary. But performance requires energy, and energy runs out. When the mask drops, resentment appears, not just toward herself for pretending, but toward him for not seeing through it, for loving the role instead of the person, even though she created the role. That resentment feeds dissatisfaction. I've seen this play out many times. A man is confused because the woman he married isn't the woman he dated. Her preferences changed. Her tolerance changed. Her tone changed. He feels misled. She feels trapped. Neither recognizes the root. She didn't change. She stopped performing. But because the performance was never named, its end feels like betrayal. This connects directly to immaturity. Many women enter relationships without a clear sense of self. They know what they're supposed to want, what looks good, what will be approved, but they haven't examined their own values deeply enough to live by them. So they choose partners based on image, status, approval, security. They pursue lives that look right rather than feel right. And then they wonder why dissatisfaction follows them. A woman who doesn't know who she is cannot recognize what she needs, and needs that aren't recognized can't be communicated honestly. Instead, they surface as frustration. Another trait that appeared consistently was lack of boundaries. Women who were chronically unhappy often absorbed everyone else's emotions. Family expectations, social pressure, cultural standards. They had no internal separation between what they wanted and what others expected of them. So they felt overwhelmed, exhausted, resentful. Not because anyone forced them, but because they never defined themselves clearly enough to say no. That resentment had to go somewhere. It often went to the partner. He became the embodiment of a life she felt trapped inside, even if he never imposed it. This is why dissatisfaction can feel so personal and yet be so misplaced. I also noticed how many women use testing as a substitute for communication. They would provoke reactions to feel secure, create small conflicts to measure commitment, withdraw affection to see if it would be chaste. These behaviors aren't calculated, they're learned, and they're destructive. Testing creates instability. Instability creates anxiety. Anxiety erodes trust, and trust is the foundation of contentment. Yet the cycle continues because the short-term reassurance from being chased feels like connection, even as the long-term damage accumulates. Another layer of immaturity is the inability to tolerate boredom. Many women equate intensity with meaning, drama with depth, emotional highs and lows with love. So when peace arrives, it feels empty. When stability sets in, it feels dead. They don't know how to live inside calm. I've watched women sabotage genuinely good relationships because there was nothing to fix. No tension to manage, no crisis to navigate. The quiet felt wrong, so they created noise. This isn't manipulation, it's conditioning. When dysfunction feels like home health feels foreign. Another factor that fed dissatisfaction was the inability to take responsibility for emotional states. Many women were taught that feelings are facts, that discomfort must be caused by someone, that accountability is external. So instead of asking, "Why do I feel this way?" they ask, "Who made me feel this way?" That question guarantees blame. Therapy culture has unintentionally reinforced this in some cases. Instead of teaching regulation and responsibility, it is taught vocabulary. Language to justify dissatisfaction, words to medicalize preference, terms to frame every conflict as harm. I knew a couple where the woman had been in therapy for a decade. Instead of becoming more grounded, she became more dissatisfied. Every disagreement was reframed as emotional invalidation. Every tired response became unavailability. Every boundary became control. The language gave structure to her unhappiness, not resolution. The man learned to walk on eggshells made of psychological terms. He wasn't allowed to be human, only compliant. This deepened her dissatisfaction because no amount of validation satisfied a state that required constant reinforcement. What became clear was this: when identity is built around dissatisfaction, growth feels threatening, because growth would dissolve the identity. For some women, unhappiness becomes how they receive care, how they bond, how they stay seen. Without it, they feel invisible. So they protect it. This is why making an unhappy woman happy often fails. You remove the familiar mechanism she uses to relate to the world. And without replacing it with something internal, she feels lost. That loss gets blamed on the man. Once I saw this, I stopped mistaking emotional complexity for depth. Many people aren't deep. They're unresolved. And unresolved people turn relationships into containers for their confusion. At this stage, the pattern reached its most destructive form: superiority. Not confidence, not self-respect. A quiet, internalized belief that men exist beneath her. That they are means not equals. Tools for provision, validation, stability. Replaceable roles in a personal narrative. This belief doesn't always announce itself. It shows up subtly, in tone, in dismissal, in contempt disguised as humor, in phrases like "men are all the same" or "they're basically animals." Statements said casually without reflection, yet carrying a deep psychological consequence. You cannot respect what you see as inferior, and you cannot be happy with someone you do not respect. I knew a woman who spoke about men this way, openly. She wasn't cruel. She was convinced she was telling the truth. She believed men were simple, predictable, and largely interchangeable. At the same time, she couldn't understand why her relationships felt hollow, why intimacy never satisfied her, why she always felt disconnected. The contradiction was invisible to her. She wanted devotion from someone she didn't admire, stability from someone she looked down on, depth from someone she reduced. That dynamic cannot produce fulfillment. It produces control and resentment. This sense of superiority often comes wrapped in modern ideology. Being told from a young age that she is a prize, a queen, a goddess. That men should feel lucky to be chosen. That her mere presence is value enough. On the surface, it looks like empowerment. In practice, it erodes connection. Because when one partner is elevated and the other is diminished, polarity collapses. Desire fades. Respect dies quietly. And dissatisfaction grows. Many women in this mindset believe they are entitled to everything without reciprocal responsibility. Emotional labor, financial security, constant validation. They expect service, not partnership. And then they wonder why they feel empty. You cannot feel fulfilled in a relationship where the other person is reduced to a function. Humans need mutual recognition to feel meaning. Without it, connection becomes transactional. This superiority also feeds self-sabotage. I watched women say they wanted peace, then provoke chaos. Say they wanted stability, then test boundaries relentlessly. Say they wanted love, then reject affection. From the outside, it looks irrational. From the inside, it's familiar. Chaos feels like home. Many women grew up in emotional volatility. Love was unpredictable. Affection was inconsistent. Safety was conditional. So when adulthood brings steadiness, it feels wrong. Too quiet, too calm, too exposed. So they recreate the emotional environment they understand. This isn't conscious manipulation. It's conditioning replaying itself. I've seen women in genuinely healthy relationships create conflict out of nothing. Accusations without evidence. Suspicion without cause. Criticism without direction. Not because the relationship was bad, but because peace felt temporary. Like something waiting to be taken away. So they destroy it first. That way the ending feels controlled. Another force intensifies this behavior. The belief that there is always something better waiting. Grass is greener syndrome amplified beyond reason. Not just the thought that another man might be better, but the constant visual proof that someone else has more. More excitement, more romance, more luxury, more passion. Every feed reinforces it. Engagement announcements, Baby announcements, career wins, transformations. Each one becomes silent evidence that she chose wrong, that she settled, that she missed her chance. This creates a constant second guessing of life itself. I've watched women leave good men chasing an imagined upgrade only to recreate the same dissatisfaction with someone new. Different face, same ending. Because the problem wasn't the man, it was the orientation. The biological clock adds another pressure men rarely feel the same way. Time becomes an adversary. Every year feels like a narrowing of options, a loss of potential futures. This creates anxiety whether she has children or not. If she doesn't, she fears running out of time. If she does, she fears the life she didn't live. Either way, dissatisfaction finds fuel. I once spoke with a woman nearing 40, successful, intelligent, thoughtful. She told me she followed the plan perfectly. Career first, independence, experiences, freedom. She did everything she was told would make her fulfilled, and yet she felt trapped. The plan was wrong, she said, and now it's too late. That regret wasn't directed at a man, but he absorbed it anyway. He became the embodiment of a life that didn't turn out as imagined. This is another way dissatisfaction transfers. Regret looking for a container. Then there's manipulation, often unconscious. Boundary testing framed as curiosity. Emotional withdrawal framed as needing space. Drama created to feel intensity. These behaviors are attempts to regulate internal states externally, to feel something, to regain control, but they backfire. Manipulation destroys trust. Testing creates instability. Drama exhausts everyone. And yet from the inside, it feels like survival. All of this leads to the darkest realization. For many women, unhappiness becomes identity. They bond through complaint. They receive attention through victimhood. They avoid responsibility by blaming others. After years of dissatisfaction, happiness feels foreign, almost threatening. Who would I be without my pain? That question terrifies more people than they admit. So they stay unhappy. Not because they want to suffer, but because suffering is familiar, structured, known. This is why solving problems often makes things worse. You remove one complaint, another appears. You meet one need, another emerges. You calm one storm, another forms. The dissatisfaction isn't about problems. It's about continuity. Men who don't see this burn themselves out trying to win a game that cannot be won. They believe persistence equals love, that endurance equals loyalty. They don't realize they're feeding a system that requires dissatisfaction to exist. Understanding this doesn't fix the woman. It isn't meant to. It clarifies reality. And clarity is the last defense a man has before he loses himself entirely. Before you leave, there's one lesson here that reaches far beyond relationships, and it matters more than most people realize. You cannot save someone from a life they refuse to take responsibility for. Love does not replace self-awareness. Effort does not override identity. And sacrifice does not heal wounds that were never yours to carry. Many people spend years believing that if they are patient enough, kind enough, or strong enough, they can become the solution to another person's inner unrest. That belief is noble, and it is also destructive. Real maturity begins when you understand the limits of your influence. You can support. You can listen. You can care deeply. But you cannot build a stable life with someone who is unwilling to face themselves. Trying to do so doesn't make you loving. It makes you disappear slowly. The hardest truth is this peace is not something you earn by pleasing others. It's something you protect by choosing clarity. When you stop confusing responsibility with self-erasure, something shifts. You begin to recognize where your role ends and another person's work begins, and in that boundary, dignity returns. This isn't about blame. It's about honesty, about recognizing patterns early, about valuing your own stability as much as someone else's feelings. Life becomes lighter when you stop carrying weight that was never meant to be yours. If this resonated with you, I'd like to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment and tell me what stood out or where you're listening from and what time it is there. And if you value conversations that are calm, grounded, and real, consider subscribing to the channel. Quietly, no pressure.